In Deuteronomy, the Lord is preparing his people for a new land. God is preparing them to build a new generation and generations after them. And it's as if it's a reset, and they get to start over. So what we read in Deuteronomy is laying the foundation for what it looks like to live in this world. What is it that God honors? What is it that he values? And literally the sermon that we're in of Moses, Deuteronomy is a series of sermons that Moses preached. Some would say it was broken up, but it looks like he preached one sermon from chapter 5 all the way to chapter 26. And that's a lot of stuff. We'd be here till about 8 or 9 tonight if we covered all that. But what you'll find in that, you'll find a lot of different things. He talks about purity. He talks about relationships. He talks about marriage. He talks about the culture, the neighbors, how you treat the sojourner, the immigrant for us. How do you worship? The festivals, the feasts, the leaders, the priests, the prophets, the kings. I mean, he touches on everything. But there are 3 big ideas that he really kind of builds everything around. One is worship. Another, leadership. And the final is our relationships. And I think it's around those 3 themes that really you find everything in those chapters from 5 through 26. But let me pick the one that I think is most critical, and the one I want us to talk about today is worship. Worship. God wanted to make sure they got it right. And my greatest desire is to make sure we get it right. Because the way I look at worship is this. If we don't have a genuine encounter with God, if we don't really hear truth and hear him, we didn't just waste an hour. We wasted 7,000 hours for every one of you that are here. And so this is critical, and it's a critical piece of the puzzle that God is building and putting together for them to see. So the first question I've got to ask you is, have you ever wondered what laws in the Old Testament carry over in the New? Because it's very important to understand worship and what we're going to read about worship to understand this principle. It's a big issue out there. A big issue. What is it in the Old Testament, especially in the laws, that's going to apply in the New Testament? Okay? For example, how many of you have on either a shirt, dress, pants, or something that is not 100% cotton? It's a mix of some sort. Raise your hand. Okay, you are all unclean. You need to step out and go right out that door over there. According to the Old Testament law. How many of you have eaten shrimp in the last 48 hours? Okay, you're unclean. Y'all go this way. I mean, there are all kinds of laws. I mean, there are all kinds. And there are people who say, well, every one of them, we still abide by every one of them. Well, have you stoned a teenager lately? No. So what is the principle? And I want to show you in just a quick fashion how we read what we're about to read and understand how it makes a difference today for us. A couple of passages, I want you to write these down. One is Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13. Just write the reference, Hebrews 8:13. In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. That is a reference to the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Old Covenant, the New Covenant. And it's Hebrew, the writer saying, Jesus is superior to it all. The new has come. Okay? Here's another one. Paul, Romans chapter 10. I love this one. Verse 4. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. Or Christ is the fulfillment of the law. Even Jesus said, hey, he didn't come to abolish, but to fulfill. So what does it mean? I think the best approach is probably the oldest. A church father by the name of Tertullian, at the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century, he broke the laws of the Old Testament down into 3 groups, and he said only one of them carries over in the New Testament. Here are the 3 groups. First, ceremonial law. He said there are laws in the Old Testament, and by the way, Martin Luther picked this up, the reformer in the 1500s, and then the Westminster Confession in the 1600s adopted this same view. It's a solid way to look at the Old Testament law and understand how it all connects. Ceremonial law are those laws that are related to ceremonies that fit their culture and their day. They don't necessarily carry over if you don't see them in the New Testament explicitly mentioned. Second group would be actually laws that apply in given situations that are called civil laws, meaning government. There was a different type of government in the Old Testament. It's called a theocracy. God was the king. And so there were certain things said about that obviously once you get the New Testament where Rome has a king and our day that are different. Principles may carry, but there may be some specifics. The third one is moral law, like the Ten Commandments. In other words, is it still wrong to kill? Yes. Is it still wrong to commit adultery? Yes. There are certain moral laws that transcend culture and time, and so today, even in the New Testament, you see them affirmed. That is the grouping that carries over. In fact, one of the great ways to help you understand this is to look at it this way. When the New Testament affirms a law, when the New Testament speaks to a law, when Jesus speaks to it, you can pretty well bet He still expects us to follow. There are some that now are not physical in nature, but they're spiritual. In other words, the physicality of it has changed to a spiritual emphasis. I'll give you an example, circumcision. Okay, many still practice circumcision. That's great. We could debate the merits of it, but here's what you need to understand. In the Old Testament, it was a physical thing, right? Very physical, guys, very physical. Paul, in the New Testament, says it's not the circumcision of the flesh, but the circumcision of the heart. So he takes what was a physical reality and he brings it into a spiritual dimension. For example, Jesus said, "You have heard it said that thou shalt not commit adultery." That's a physical act. Then he says, "But I say unto you, that if a man looks upon a woman with lust," that's not a physical act. That's a mental, that's an internal, that's a spiritual issue. So a lot of the laws will find their way into the New Testament in that spiritual sense. That's exactly what we see today and what we're going to read, is how God took worship and the principles of worship in the Old Testament, and He absolutely, I personally believe this is one of those moments in my life where I read this, I began to study this, and Jimmy Nott and I sat and talked about this, and it got bigger and bigger, and it got more incredible in my mind of what God did for worship for us. As I saw what He said to them, and now I understand what He wants from us today. Here's a great example of how the Old Testament fits with the New, including the laws. This weekend, there is a rivalry game between the Florida Gators and the FSU Seminoles. Okay? There is no need to divulge your allegiance in this moment. But to help me here, listen and listen to this. There is a play that the Seminoles run successfully quite often. I am willing to bet everything I have that the Gators are going to practice that play. They're going to practice it over and over against first-team defense. Why? Get them ready for it. Because FSU is going to run it. So when they play and FSU runs that play, my question is, did FSU run it because the Gators practiced it? Or did the Gators practice it because FSU is going to run it? It's that. You say, what's the point? Jesus didn't come to fit in to what was done in the Old Testament. The Old Testament was written to prepare us for Jesus. The Old Testament is the preparation of the people for the coming of our King, Jesus. So everything in the Old Testament is running the play. Why? Because one day He's coming. And so when He shows up in the Gospels, He is literally the fulfillment, and God had prepared His people. Paul said the law is a tutor. It's a teacher that gets us ready for Christ. So what we're going to read today about worship is it's incredible how God gets us ready or gets them ready, and we see the fulfillment of it. So with that said, I want you to go, if you will, Deuteronomy chapter 11. And then we'll read in 12, the few verses in chapter 12 that open up the chapter. Read with me, first of all, Deuteronomy 11. I'm going to start reading verse 26. See, I'm setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you today. And the curse, if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside from the way that I'm commanding you today to go after other gods that you have not known. Now, verse 29 is the part of it I want you to see. And when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you're entering to take possession of it, you shall set the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal. Now, let's just stop there for a moment and talk about these mountains. God was saying something to them about setting the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal. Those mountains are actually very close to one another. And did you know that the people, when they heard this, were probably standing between those mountains at a place called Shechem? Shechem is a very important place in the Old Testament. Abraham first offered a sacrifice to God when he came into the land in Shechem. Shechem is where Jacob took Rachel and Leah. And Jacob dug a well there that Jesus comes to later and meets a woman called the Samaritan woman. So it's a very significant place. Joshua brings the people back, and they do a covenant renewal in Shechem. So I want you to imagine something. You're the people. We're getting ready to cross the river. That beautiful drop back there, the silver thing, that's the river. And so we're here ready to go, and we're going to walk between these two mountains. Because that's exactly where they were when they heard this, and they walked right between them. So this is what God says, okay? That mountain, you're going west. This is west. That mountain on your right, which is to your north, that is Mount Ebal. That is the mountain of curse. Now, the mountain is not cursed, because later they have a sacrifice up there. But it's a picture. God's saying curse is on the right. On the left is a mountain called Mount Gerizim. And I want you to remember that, Mount Gerizim. That's the mountain of blessing. So I believe what God is doing is showing this incredible object lesson to the people. And he says, you got to choose which mountain you're going to. You got to choose which way you live. Next weekend, that is exactly what I want to talk about is the choice is yours. You're going to be at Mount Ebal, you're going to be at Mount Gerizim. And so what would happen is the people would walk between them. And as they walked between them, they were these huge reminders of blessing and curse. On the right, that was curse. On the right was curse. On the left was blessing. Now, the rabbis actually taught that the reason Gerizim was the blessing and Ebal was the curse is, watch this. If I'm facing west, where they crossed the river, Jerusalem is to my left. Jerusalem is to the south. The rabbis taught that the reason this mountain is cursed is to look at this mountain, you have to turn your back on Jerusalem. I think that has great merit. In fact, I think to follow after other gods, to go after anything else is to turn your back on your one true God. And so there's the curse, there's the blessing. They're going to walk between it. I want you to remember which one is the blessing. It's called Mount Gerizim. Now read on in verse 1 of chapter 12. These are the statutes and the rules that you shall be careful to do in the land that the Lord your God, your Father, has given you to possess all the days that you live on the earth. You shall surely destroy all the places. Why don't you underline every time you see the word place or the places, okay? Watch this. Just underline it whenever you see it. You shall surely destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods, on the high mountains, on the hills, under every green tree. You shall tear down their altars, dash into pieces the pillars, burn their asherim with fire. Those are little idols. You shall chop down the carved images of their gods, destroy their name out of that place. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, but you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put his name and to make his habitation there. There you shall go. Verse 8, you shall not do according to all that we are doing here today. Everyone does whatever is right in his own eyes, For you have not as yet come to the rest and the inheritance that the Lord your God is giving. In other words, you're not in the land yet. So when you get there, this is what I want you to remember. When you go over the Jordan and you live in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, when he gives you rest from your enemies so that you have safety, then, verse 11, to the place that the Lord your God will choose to make his name dwell, there you bring all I command you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, your contributions. You present all your finest vow offerings that you vow to the Lord. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, and your sons and your daughters and your male servants, female servants, and the Levite within your town, since he has no portion or inheritance with you. Take care that you do not offer your burnt offerings at any place you see. In other words, you don't offer your offerings just at any place, but at the place that the Lord will choose, one of your tribes. There you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I am commanding you. Thank you, Danny. So here's the deal. Places matter to us, don't they? Places matter. It's just the way we are. How many of you remember the house you grew up in? Raise your hand. Man, it's a memory. I mean, Miranda Lambert's song, The House That Built Me, a lot of you know exactly what that means. Rachel and I, every time we go back to El Dorado, we were there recently, we go by her house that she grew up in. And that house is special. Why? Memories, connections. What are the other places that are special to us? I'll show you a picture of one. See if you can tell me where it is. So all you Cowboy fans, today, if they're at home, I don't know if are they playing at home today? No? Well, probably next Sunday or next weekend, there will be a whole bunch of people who will go to that place and worship. Not the same God, but that's a sacred place, man. That's where the Cowboys play. How about this one? This is a cool place. You know where that is? Lambeau. Randy, I did that for you. Where are you? There you are. Any Green Bay Packer fan in here knows that is holy ground, right? Rachel and I drove by it a few years ago when we were up in Wisconsin. I was speaking at an event, and I'm telling you, I drove by it and the ground began to move. I mean, it was the Lambeau Leap. I mean, all those things make these places special. Memories, connections. How about this one? You ever seen this one? You know where that is? Graceland, the home of Elvis Presley. And there are pilgrims that go there all the time, and especially in August on the date of his death. Oh my goodness, they just go there and they lay wreaths and they do all kinds of strange stuff, light candles, all kind of crazy stuff, all right? Places mean things to us. They mean something, and it's okay. Places also mean things to God. And what he is saying to his people is, hey, you don't worship me just any way. And you don't worship me at just any place. Okay? Keep that in mind. You don't just worship me any way. Look at verse 4. He says in verse 4, you shall not worship the Lord your God in that way. What way? The way they did, in the pagans. So verse 3 says you tear down everything that has to do with those places, the altars, the pillars, burn the Asherim with fire, chop down the carved images. Every Canaanite worshiper, Canaanites were one of the big groups in the Promised Land that they had to fight. They would find hilltops, they would find trees, and this is horrible, but I'm just telling you the truth. They would go and have sex under those trees and on those hilltops, hoping to manipulate Baal, their god, into blessing the land. It's called the fertility rites. They had to wear, and all of the folks in the land worshiped that way. So God's saying, hey, you don't worship that way. They worship to get God to do something, their God to do something. They worship to manipulate God. So what he says is, I want you to go tear every one of them down, and I want you to remove everything that has to do with that pagan God. Because that's not who I am. And that's not how you worship. Guys, follow me. We don't worship to get something from God. We worship to give God something, and that's praise and glory due His name. We don't come in with the attitude we want to manipulate. We're going to do something that makes God going to bless us this week. And somehow if we come in and worship, God's going to do what we ask. No, He isn't. We don't come to manipulate. We come to surrender. We wave the white flag when we worship and say, God, we are yours. That's different. They didn't do that. And He says, you don't worship at the places they worshiped. They worshiped on hilltops. They worshiped under trees. They had all these kind of places they'd go. God said, no, that's not you. You worship where I show you. You worship at the place. Now follow me. That phrase, the place, occurs 17 times in chapters 5 through 26. 17 times. So yes, God is interested in the place. And He wanted His people to worship at the place. God is concerned about the place. Now follow me. Where is the place? Where was the place? Well, He said, I will show you and I will put my name there. So if you take what we just read and you follow it in the Old Testament, we know that He established His name at certain places where they built an altar, where they would build an altar and they would worship. And then finally there would be a temple that would be built under Solomon. Solomon built this incredible temple, and it was where everybody would go up and worship. Everyone would go and find God. That was the place. You had to go to the temple. That was the pilgrimage that a Jew would take. Go to Jerusalem. Go to that temple. And then something really tragic happened in 605 BC. A pagan nation called Babylon. The Babylonians destroyed that temple and took the people away. So all of a sudden they have no place. When they come back from exile under King Cyrus, they build it back under Zerubbabel, who led them in the building. It was built around 515, restored. And now they're more serious about the place. Now they're committed to that place. You go to Jerusalem. In fact, that's why in the New Testament, every time Jerusalem is referenced, it's up to Jerusalem. That doesn't mean Jerusalem was high. It just means that Jerusalem, in their mind, was the holy city. Now follow me. Then Jesus shows up. In the 2nd chapter of John, He shows up and He says, destroy this temple, I'll build it back in 3 days. And they looked at Him and said, it took us 46 years to build this incredible temple. Wrong place. All of a sudden, something was changing. The place. Remember, we run the play in the Old Testament to get ready for the play that's coming in the New Testament. Turn to John chapter 4. John chapter 4. Jesus is back at Shechem. He's at a well that Jacob dug. And there's a Samaritan woman there. Now, that land is Samaria's land now. Samaritans were half-breeds between Assyrians and Jews. They were hated. But all of a sudden, Jesus shows up that day, and He's sitting at the well, and there's a woman, a Samaritan woman, who's shocked that a Jew would even talk to her. But it's not that the Jew would talk to her. It's what Jesus said to her that takes worship and turns it upside down. Watch this. He tells her everything about her life, chapter 4. And she finally comes to the moment, verse 19. The woman said to Him, Sir, I perceive that you're a prophet. Our fathers worshiped on this mountain. By the way, what was this mountain for her? Mount Gerizim. You remember that mountain? As we're going across the river, Ebal is curse, Gerizim is the blessing. She knew that mountain. The Samaritans believed that's where you should worship, not Jerusalem. So she said, well, we believe that it's Mount Gerizim. And Jesus said this, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here. I think He's referring not just to time, but to geography. I think he's saying to the woman, I'm here. I am the place. It's not that mountain. It's not this mountain. I am the place. The time is coming and is now here when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit. So all of a sudden, Jesus said, hey, it's not about a mountain. It's not about a place. Jesus just said it's not Jerusalem. They thought Jerusalem was the place for years. It's not Jerusalem. The Samaritans thought it was Mount Gerizim, where the blessing was. Nope. Then where is it? Jesus, John chapter 2, tear this temple down, I'll build it up in 3 days. And they said, it took us 46 years to build that temple. And Jesus goes, wrong temple. He is the temple. Mark 13, Jesus teaching in the temple courts, last week of his life, probably on Tuesday. His disciples, for some reason, made this strange remark about how beautiful the temple was. He looked at them and said, the day's coming, and it's soon, when not one stone will be left on another. And then he began to talk about the end and what would happen when Jerusalem was surrounded. You know when that happened? 70 A.D. 70 A.D. The temple was destroyed by the Romans. Where's the place? It's gone. No, it isn't. The place is alive and well. Alive and well. Paul said, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, do you not know your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit? All of a sudden, the New Testament is running the play God was running in the Old Testament to get them ready for it. And he was saying, you don't just worship anywhere, you worship at the place. And it's not about where the pagans worship. It's not about how the pagans worship. It's about how I have called you to myself. And I will put my name somewhere and you to worship me there. And guess what? Today, I'm standing here to tell you that the new place, as Jesus came to this earth, he said, I am the place. You worship me there. Where is he? He lives in every one of us. We are now the temple of God. We are the temple of the Holy Spirit. Jesus living in us. He is the temple. He's the place. And let me show you, in the future, we'll all see this with our eyes. John is on the island of Patmos. Revelation is written as a vision of what's coming one day. Chapter 21 tells this story about what's not there. There's no mourning, there's no crying, there's no pain, there's no sickness, all of that. And then this verse. And I saw no temple in the city. What? No building? I saw no temple. For its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb. No building. So what was God preparing his people for? He was preparing them to understand that worship is not about a building. It's not about an instrument. It is about you, from your heart, worshiping the one who lives in you. And that is, to me, one of the most refreshing things. Because if you take that and you realize what happened with that, did you know Christianity is the only religion that worship is built on that? It's the only one. Take, for example, Islam. The 5 pillars of Islam. One of those pillars is you're to take a pilgrimage to Mecca. You're to go to Mecca. At least one time in your life, a good Muslim will go to Mecca. Why Mecca? Because it's the holy place. In the year 2012, over 3 million Muslims made their way to Mecca. Is there a pilgrimage in Christianity? Yep, there is. But you don't take it because he already has. You see, the good news is this. We don't go to Mecca. Mecca came to us. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. When we could not go to where he was, he came to us. And so he says to us, it's not about a building. It's not about a place. It is about me living in you. That is the sacred place. That is where you worship, right here. So what are the lessons from this? I wrote 2 down. One, we can worship anywhere. We can worship anywhere. We're about to be all out, which means we're not going to be in this room, which means some of you will be unsettled. You've always known this room as the place of worship. It will be unsettling. Here's the good news. Worship is not about a room. You're in Faith Hall. We're going to be in Henry Chapel. We're going to be down in the Student Center. There's some classes that are going to stay in their classroom. That's awesome. Because you know what? What makes this so exciting? Yes, we're all out, but He is all in, every one of us. And so we go to places, I don't care, we can worship at Walmart. Some of you do every week. We can worship at Walmart. We can worship in the middle of a field. You know why? Because God gave us this incredible gift. We don't worship like everybody else. We don't go to Stonehenge. We don't go to the places on the earth that we think are sacred. No, we simply turn our eyes to the heavens and we worship because God lives in us. He is the temple. He is the place that man meets God. We now have this gift. So we can worship anywhere. We worship anywhere. Now, you take that and you practically apply it. I mean, you just kind of follow that out a little bit. And what's this? That's why I believe without a doubt that our worship when we come back in this room is going to be so cool. Here's why. Not because we're in a big room and it's an awesome room and all that. No. It's not about a room. It's because a bunch of private worshipers are going to come back in here and we're going to fill this room with the praise of God. I believe that when you and I understand that, we can have the most incredible worship on Monday morning. We can worship on Tuesday. We can worship on Wednesday. We worship on Thursday. We worship on Friday. We worship every day. Why? Because it's not about a place. It's not about a building. It's right here. And some of you have long commutes every day to go to work. And if you drive I-4, you need to worship. You need to be in the presence of God. And I just think that worship has been given to us as a gift, and unfortunately, we've made it about places, we've made it about things, we've made it about music, we've made it about this person or that person, and I think it's time to bring it back to the heart of worship, and it is about a God who lives in us, and we can worship Him anywhere, anytime. One of the greatest worship moments I've had this week, it happened actually 2 weeks ago, was in a parking lot when a man stood outside my door of my pickup and sang praises to God. And we're standing, I'm sitting in a truck, he's standing in a parking lot, and he sang a song of praise to the Lord. And I sat there and could not believe what I was hearing. And by the way, my friend Keith is that man. I'll never forget that moment when he did that. And I think if you'll think back, moments that you've had in worship. So this morning, what we're going to do in just a second is we're going to worship. We're going to ignore the building. We're going to ignore the stuff. And we're going to come in the presence of God in this moment in our life, in our heart, to say, God, there is no one worthy but you. Now let me speak to one of the things that we tend to do, we're prone to do. And that is we're prone to go to places or hang on and try to connect. For example, when someone is killed or someone is lost, it doesn't take long for us to have a memorial on the side of the road. In fact, this one is the Boston Memorial. It happened immediately. As soon as that event happened and that tragedy happened, all of a sudden people began to bring stuff and they left it there. Here's another one, and I don't know who this one is, but it's a guy that evidently was killed and so stuff was left. We've all seen these. I remember going to the grave just a few weeks ago with Rachel, the grave of my mother-in-law and father-in-law, her mom and dad. And we stood there. Is all of this okay? Sure it is. You know why? Because we're trying to get as close to that person we lost as we can. And it may be the grave that helps us connect with them. It may wherever. We're just trying to get as close as we can. So it's perfectly fine when it's a loved one you lost. It is all wrong when it's a God who lives in you. So you don't have to go anywhere to connect with God. You see, that is what's radical about Christianity. God is already with us. So we don't try to go to a place and we don't try to do things to connect. We don't bring offerings hoping that God will hear them or see them. No, no, no. Our connection with God is already sure. Why? Because Jesus came, gave himself for us, and now through the Holy Spirit lives in every one of us. That's why God hates idolatry. That's why he hates idols. You know why? Why would you have an idol when you got the real thing? Why would you talk to a carved image when you have him? That would be like me coming in your house this afternoon, knocking on the door, and you come to the door, and I never look at you. I look at your house and go, man, I'm just glad to be here, and I just want to come by and pray for you. And you're going, hey, I'm over here, and I never look at you and never acknowledge you, but I talk to your house. How would you feel? That's how God feels when we never engage in true worship, which is directly to him. You don't need a building. You don't need an image. You don't need anything. You have all you need to worship God. You have him. And that is a beautiful thing. It's a gift. So the first lesson, we can worship anywhere. The second one is, buildings aren't sacred, you are. People are. Did you know there's not a place in the New Testament where there is a sacred building? Not one. There's not a place in the New Testament where there's a sacred place. Why? The emphasis changes. People. That's where God comes to live. He could have lived anywhere in the universe, and he chose to live in you. You're the sacred place. You are the sacred in the eyes of God, not a building. And when I think about how God has done that, what he's done for me, that he lives in me, there are 96 images of the church. Paul Meniere's, a New Testament theologian, found 96 images of the church, 96 metaphors. Not one of them is about a building. It's all about people, just like us. I personally believe that's why God let the temple be destroyed. In 70 A.D., when Titus marched in with the Romans, they leveled that building. That was the holiest place on the earth. Think about it. Just you do the logic. The temple in Jerusalem was the holiest site. It had been the site of 2 previous temples. And it was the place where everybody would come. The Psalms of Ascent were written as you're going up to the temple. So why would God allow the holiest place to be destroyed? You don't need it. God has given you himself. That's all you need. Why would God allow the Ark of the Covenant to be taken? It's gone. Indiana Jones found it, and then it got lost again. Did you know that is the most sacred piece of furniture in history? The most sacred piece of furniture. On that ark was the mercy seat, which is the basis of all the sacrifices of God's people. Why would God allow the most sacred piece of furniture to just disappear? Because there's a new mercy seat in Jesus. You don't need the Ark of the Covenant. You don't need the mercy seat. You have him. And this morning, you don't need anything. You already have him. And what God desires is that you worship him just like that.